This is LaunchPad, the Jamf admin meetup, hosted by Rocketman. A few of us here are Rocketman. Most of you are various Jamf admins from companies across the globe, which is really cool. The whole intention of this meetup is to talk about everything Apple and Jamf and get some of the best minds in the industry to just, kind of do that crazy test. I know some of you are the only Jamf admin at your company, and some of you are on teams that are seeing some of the most complex issues that Jamf and Apple have out there. So being able to just combine our knowledge and get through this weird world is the whole idea of Launchpad. We are right on time to get the presentation over to Sean Rabbitt, who will be talking about macOS platform single sign-on. And Sean has been, I mean, most people on this meetup, I think, know Sean. For those of you, if this is your introduction, he's been a consulting engineer at Jamf for about 6.5 years, worked for Apple for 10 years. He's a pillar of this industry. If you've ever been to a JNUC or if you've been around, you've probably run into Sean somewhere at JNUC or on the forums. We're super excited to have him here. Looks like he's got the sharing all set up and is ready to go.
The man, the myth, the Mohawk. The Mohawk needs some help today, but fear not. Yes, so my job title today is Senior Consulting Engineer for Identity and Access Management here at Jamf. I am also a member of the Jamf Nation Global Foundation Board, and what that is the charitable arm of Jamf as well. So I would love everyone here and encourage you to take a look at whatever resources you have available to help folks out in LA. It is a disaster of epic proportion and has affected people in the Mac admins community directly. Like people's houses have actually gone completely up in flames. So as a side note, before we get started on identity and access management, let's get some people some resources so they can hopefully have a place to stay in the next few months. That being said, hi, let's talk about platform single sign-on today. So the wonderful world of what the heck is this thing? What is platform single sign-on? We're going to talk a little bit about the authentication methods that has been created as part of the spec for platform single sign-on and what the differences really are to you and your users. We'll talk about the identity providers that actually support this and what to do in case your identity provider does not support it. And lastly, we're going to get into deployment because everybody wants to push this neat new toy out to all their end users. So in the spirit of a Steve Jobs keynote, let's talk about first what the heck is platform single sign-on. So it is a framework built in the macOS that is supported by an identity provider with an application that is pushed out along with the configuration from an MDM. Now, unfortunately, Steve would probably have you flip these slides around a couple times more at this point and say, hey, it's just one thing. Unfortunately, these are all 3 separate devices and 3 separate applications from 3 separate vendors. So with apologies to Steve, yes, it's going to be a bit more complicated than just breaking out your iPhone for the first time. So why has it been like this, though? A little bit of history before we jump into what's currently out there. Identity on macOS has always been this weird combination of a couple of different things. So even when we went back to LDAP binding in the beginning, you still had an identity provider out there. It just happened to be Open Directory or Active Directory. And with all the love that Apple gave to it at the time there, it was yeah, it was pretty terrible. In fact, binding your Mac to AD is still pretty terrible. That's why they came up with the Kerberos single sign-on extension that allows you to have a true local macOS Unix 1970s username and password on your Mac, but it also happens to talk to an identity provider, in that case, Active Directory, so it can grab Kerberos tickets to do all the other important stuff, like get into your file shares or get access to that vital printer that you obviously are using so much in your office on premises that you're visiting. No one ever goes in the office anymore. Anyway, so because everyone decided to leave their offices because of some strange thing that happened, I think it was 2 weeks ago. I think it's still 2020, right? Yeah, I think it's like anyway. we all had to leave, and so they all came up with the idea of extensible single sign-on for identity providers. And what this got you here is modernizing the identity into a cloud-based system. This allowed you to have the idea of having a local Unix user account and still be able to log into those cloud resources seamlessly. The idea is you'd have a local Unix user account and you happen to log into things like Salesforce and just automatically log in. Uh, didn't actually do anything for creating the user accounts or keeping the local user account in sync with a cloud identity provider. And that's where Jamf Connect was invented. And what's now come out from Apple is the idea of platform single sign-on, where the login and the local username can be synced up as part of the operating system itself. Again, that framework built into macOS in order to keep the passwords in sync. So this framework for macOS is built into macOS 13 and greater, although if you do want to experiment with it, I would recommend jumping right off of 13, go at least to 14 or 15. It is built on the concept of that enterprise single sign-on extension for macOS, and its primary goal has always been to make sure that people can get into their cloud-based resources. As an extra added bonus feature, when the macOS 13 was created, it added the ability to either log into the Mac with your user credentials and keep that password in sync, and added in iOS 15, or excuse me, 14, was the ability to say, okay, ignore the local user account password completely. We don't care. We'll just put an MDM profile on the device to say your minimum password requirement is blah. And it would turn the secure element of your Mac into essentially a FIDO2 token, a YubiKey, a hardware authenticator. So these are the two things the framework lets you do. Now, that's going to depend entirely on your identity provider. So your identity provider, it comes in to be very vital in this scenario for two reasons. One, they get to decide how they want to interact with the Mac to authorize you into services that they are protecting. The second piece here is that you need to have an application written by that identity provider with special entitlements and credentials given to it by Apple, with a well-known endpoint published to a public location that says this specific bundle identifier of this specific app made by this organization is responsible for authentication and authorization of resources on that Mac. That means that Jimmy off the street can't go and create an application that starts getting credentials for your Entra gated resources. It has to be Microsoft that creates the application. This has been a bit of a fun time because we here at Jamf would really love to have written that application, but it's not the way the framework was written. That's fine. That's fine. Now, where Jamf does kick in here, though, is that you do need to deploy an application to all of these endpoints, and you need to have a combined with a configuration profile pushed down to the endpoint to actually activate the service. But added bonus here too is there's not really any great way to read the status of what the registration is on the device. But Jamf Pro, because it has the ability to create extension attributes and read information as part of an inventory for a recon, we can actually read stuff locally on the device to determine the state of the registration. And that could be using some of the native commands built into macOS in order to determine the status of the registration, or it could be going in and reading specific details on a user's inventory or user's directory record locally on the Mac, and then be able to report that up. So once you deploy this brand new platform single sign-on to your Macs, your login screen will go from looking like this to looking like this. I know it might come shocking to you, but there's absolutely no change that it appears to the end users at all. There's really nothing here. It really just is still logging in locally with a macOS user account. It's still a local password on the device. It just happens to be that the password keeps itself in sync with something up in the cloud, or optionally, the password didn't change at all. And that's where we get into the confusion of what people think this really is and what it ends up being. This platform single sign-on is not passwordless authentication under any circumstances. There is no such thing as passwordless authentication on macOS to get in and start up a session. You have to type in a passcode on this thing every time that you turn it off and turn it back on. You can't get to Face ID yet. Same thing with macOS. When you have File Vault enabled on that Mac, you have to type in a password, or you'll have to type in a PIN in coordination with a smart card. It is not multi-factor authentication. So for those of you that have some sort of mandate from your security group there saying that you need to have multiple factors to get into your Mac and start a session, this is not it. It is literally a single password. End of story, hard stop. And the grand fallacy here is that this does not affect the File Vault login screen at all in the slightest. You still need to have a password or a smart card to get into File Vault. Um, there are some things that have been added in macOS 15 that makes it even more interesting and in new ways to lock your users out of the computers, but we'll get into that in a second. And lastly, this is not something that works in a zero-touch onboarding workflow. You absolutely have to have at least one user account on the machine first, then the device needs to get registered, then platform single sign-on will work. Because it relies upon that application that gets installed by the MDM, a login screen can't actually run a third-party application. Your root at the login screen, the root then creates a user session that lets you run other additional applications. Applications don't run as root at the login screen, so you actually have to be a user to enable this feature to work. Which also means that for those of you that are trying to do this in a laboratory type environment or a shared desk environment, that means that somebody has to physically touch each individual computer at least once in order to register the device to make it get into this shared platform mode. So just keep that in mind. You're going to have a Unix user account on the machine for this to work. Now, why is that? 1960 something was the invention of Unix and running on a PDP-3, I believe. And since that point, macOS has been built on Unix, and Unix doesn't change. There's a reason why the ruts in the road are still 8.5 feet wide, because the Romans decided that they needed to build their carts that way for the wars. And I'm sure it's because all the farmers had those ruts in the roads from their carts too. Standards never die. It's just how this is. So up until this point, passcodes are essential to the security of Apple devices. And don't take it from me, take it directly from the Apple Platform Security Guide. Once the user has actually used the password, then elements inside, features inside of the secure element are now available. So things like Touch ID and Face ID become available. But until you get through that initial password, there is nothing available to you. So that's why there's no passwordless workflow here in this scenario. You have to have something to unlock that secure element to be able to start doing things that are passwordless. So in addition to passwords being required on the device, there's also the idea of different authentication methods that you could use depending on your identity provider. So up to this point, we've been talking about a lot about password sync, and that's the first feature that was really introduced with platform single sign-on. The password authentication method means that we're going to take a local Linux user account on the Mac and just happen to keep it in sync with the cloud identity provider. This is very similar to if you've ever used Jamf Connect in the past. So what it does is it either will create a password sync session using ROPG, Resource Owner Password Grant, where the uh, companion application will send a username and password regularly up to the identity provider to keep it in sync, or it will create a workspace trust connection between the device and a bind, essentially, and be able to keep the password in sync there. It will also keep the local file vault password and keychain passwords up to sync for you. And it will do this regularly every 4 hours or anytime a user has to do an authentication session. And that authentication could be wake from screensaver, or it could be unlock or start up a user session, do a sudo command, et cetera, et cetera. Because it's a password and because it's literally the only way to get into the device at that point, it is not a phishing resistant credential. And it is something that you have to keep in mind when you're deploying platform single sign-on in this way, if bad actors are trying to get into the cloud resources that are gated with platform or with your cloud identity provider, and all you have is a password to get into those resources, that's going to be a target. People are going to want to try to phish that password. So keep that in mind, that modern authentication recommendations are to have a separate password that is at least 15 characters long, with some sort of complexity to it, and no expiration date in it too, by the way, so that way your end user knows, oh, when I need to get into my Mac, I'm going to type this password. The second authentication method is tied to smart cards. So everybody loves smart cards, don't they? These are a great little device, a little certificate on there. They're so simple to leave at your parents' house and then get locked out of your Mac. But in case your organization already is using smart cards, having the integration with platform single sign-on and having that be able to tie to that local Unix user account makes smart card deployment suck significantly less. Uh, I wouldn't recommend this method unless you're already using smart cards or unless you have some actual mandate from a government organization that says you absolutely must have a multi-factor authentication method to get into the Macs. But it does make it so basically you just sync up once and then it's tied to the user account and can be used for accessing whatever cloud resource you need. It's reasonably simple to set up once you actually get past the whole tying a PIV to a actual directory user, which is not trivial. But luckily, the identity providers seem to be working towards getting that a little bit easier. I know that Yubico, for example, has a way that they can automatically deploy smart cards to new users and literally drop ship them with credentials on them to end users. Remember, too, that Smart Card is literally the only multi-factor authentication solution that is native to macOS. The idea is that you have a physical token and you have to know the numbers in order to unlock that device. And it works great on Apple Silicon devices too, to be able to unlock File Vault as well. The latest that's been introduced with macOS 14 is the secure enclave-backed key. So what this will do is do absolutely nothing to the password on the Mac. It's going to ignore it completely. But what it will do is it will create a hardware-bound authentication method, non-exportable, and store it inside of the secure element of that Mac. Basically, it makes it into a FIDO key, which is great because now you have a possession-based factor of a managed device, and you have to use something like Touch ID in order to unlock that credential. Fantastic. We have phishing-resistant credentials, more secure authentication, the passkey that everyone wants in the future for accessing our cloud resources, but you will still need to have a local password on that Mac in order to get in and start that session. So that's the idea behind that factor of multi-factor is you have a knowledge-based factor to get into your Mac, and you have physical possession of the machine, but you will still have a password on that device. This is a slide that I stole lovingly from a presentation done at JNUC this last year, where we talked about deploying Microsoft Entra and platform single sign-on, excuse me. This goes over the different methods. So good is password if all you want is to sync up that password to that user in case you have a group of users that completely forget their password when they come back from Christmas vacations. Best, and what is recommended by Microsoft and Apple for the future deployments, is to deploy the secure enclave key. This is, for those of you that are multilingual, this is the Windows Hello for Business of Mac. This is what you're trying to do, except for the login to the actual device itself. Until Apple fixes File Vault, which you know all of you have seen me at various sessions before, I have strong opinions about. Until Apple fixes File Vault, there's always going to be a password there. Now, one of the things that was introduced in macOS Sonoma with and 15 is that you can actually have some additional settings applied to platform single sign-on, specifically at that File Vault screen. There are some options you can have to say require authentication. This would be the equivalent to the deny local key in case you're using Jamf Connect. But what it does is it requires that there is a line of communication between the device and the cloud identity provider. So when you are either starting up your macOS session or waking from screensaver, you absolutely must have a network connection for that to continue. Now, you can also apply this to the file vault screen. There's only one problem, though. File vault on Intel boxes, this doesn't work at all. That's step number one. Step number two, though, file vault on Apple Silicon-based processors, go start up your Mac and look for the network picker. There is none. The people that designed this were thinking about a computer sitting on a physical network and permanently attached with a plugged-in Ethernet cable. And by plugged-in Ethernet cable, by the way, I do not mean take a new USB adapter and plug it in at the file vault screen, because guess what? It's never talked to that USB device before. So if you have the requirement to say, I must authenticate and approve that USB device, it's still not going to work. If you have somebody who's a CEO on an airplane and traveling on Southwest and now suddenly can't get on the Wi-Fi and also can't unlock their Mac, they're going to be very upset and someone's going to get fired at the end of that. So be very careful with these settings. There is the concept of a grace period for initial setup now also added into macOS, and a grace period for requiring network authentication. But again, be very careful. You will lock out your users from the computers in really new and interesting ways. Also built into the payload there, though, is the ability to turn on and off the ability to use something like unlock from Apple Watch or unlock from Face ID, Touch ID as part of this payload, which is fun because that's also available in other configuration profiles. So watch out. You don't want conflicting settings. So this all sounds great. I'd love a secure enclave back key. I think that's a fantastic idea. There are two identity providers that support platform single sign-on at this time. First is Microsoft Entra ID and Okta Identity Engine. I have to specifically be on the Identity Engine update. So if you're on Okta Classic still, sorry, you're going to have to wait just a little bit. I also want to make sure that people understand the concept of who is your identity provider. I've had a lot of customers at some point say, oh, well, my identity provider is Azure. Okay, fine. You're using the old name for it. That's fine. No one's going to hurt you for that. I'm not the Microsoft police. But as it turns out, it's not actually their identity provider. Their real identity provider happens to be this federated service that they just happen to go to Microsoft, myaccount.microsoft.com, and it then redirects them to some internal service, be that ADFS, could be Shibboleth, it could be Ping, it could be anything else. Where you change your password, if you had to change your password, that is your identity provider. So if you're changing your password on-prem Active Directory, okay, that's fine. You can tie that into Entra. But if you are changing your password in a Shibboleth instance, that is where the password really is. When you federate something, the parent, if you would, Entra doesn't know what the child's actual password is. All that it really gets is a signed, sealed, addressed envelope with a stamp on it of verification saying, yes, I do solemnly swear this is that person. It's like going to a bar and showing someone your ID. The bartender doesn't get to know what state you grew up in and your copy of your birth certificate and your exact, every bit of information and copy of the little cute stamp of your foot that they took when you were born. No, they just get to know that the DMV has seen that. And that certificate that you have, your driver's license, is all you get to know. Similarly, Microsoft Entra doesn't know what the password is inside Shibboleth. All it knows is it gets a stamp on it. So you have to be using Entra or Okta Identity Engine for this to work, at least in password sync mode. Now, that's great because all of the providers out there offer the password authentication method, but only Microsoft Entra right now supports the option for a smart card or a PIV or the secure enclave back key. Okta does have secure enclave back key on their roadmap. I do not work for Okta and do not want to discuss their roadmap with them, but if you do have the desire for the most secure authentication method with platform, I recommend you talk to your Okta rep and they will give you a time frame within the next X number of years of when they will be supporting that. Added bonus, by the way, and I would recommend if you are using device compliance to go check out that JNUC session from last year. Uh, when you enroll a computer in platform single sign-on, it actually does create an object in Microsoft Entra. And that object in Entra is also happens to be used for device compliance reporting. So if you have any conditional access policies that require that the user is only able to access it from a compliant and registered and managed device, registering the device with platform single sign-on with Entra will simultaneously register the device for device compliance, which means this one less step for your end users if you're using that. You don't have to go into self-service anymore and press a button. No, just simply registering for platform single sign-on will take care of both. And it's pretty seamless. But Sean, I don't have Entra and I don't have Okta, and I'm sorry, but there is nothing that we as mere mortals are going to be able to do to be able to get other identity providers to support this until they go and visit Timothy's site. Good old Two Canoes has created a fantastic guide for identity providers to be able to support platform single sign-on. Uh, Joel and Tim created a whole bunch of different tools up there, some GitHub sample code for people. So if you have that type of access to your identity provider, or if you're doing something like you have your own Shibboleth instance and you want to support PSSO, you can start writing this stuff for yourself. And then you can get that support built into whoever's other identity provider. But it's going to get, again, remember that you need to have an application with a specific bundle identifier, with a specific well-known endpoint saying, yes, I'm the app that will do this PSSO piece, which is why we mere mortals are unable to do this on behalf of the identity providers. It has to be the identity provider that creates all this stuff. So good news, you have Jamf Pro, you have Entra, you have Okta, you have all the tools in place. Let's actually deploy this sucker. So it's a two-part process. We just need to have the identity provider application, and we need to push down a configuration profile to the max. Real simple. Microsoft uses the Microsoft Company Portal application, which also happens to be what's used for Microsoft Intune as their sort of self-service type tool. And it also is used for device compliance reporting. Just like device compliance reporting, though, you just have to have the Microsoft Company Portal app on the device. It doesn't actually need to be used for anything else. Okta Verify is the app that's used for platform single sign-on with Okta, but it's special. It's not the version that comes from the Mac App Store. So if you're deploying via VPP, you can't use that version. There is a special post-installer script in the full package version that's required for this. So you'll need to download that either from your Okta tenant, or if you want to simplify things tremendously, you can use Jamf Pro's built-in Mac apps in the Jamf app catalog. Both the company portal application as well as Okta Verify are in that. So all you need to do is just say, deploy it to my target list of devices, and we will install and update the application for you. I always recommend having a smart computer group to say that that companion application has been installed on the device. In the past, there were unexpected behaviors that would occur if you deployed the configuration profile without the app. However, now it is safe as long as you're using macOS 14 or 15. Uh, as long as you have those two versions, you can push the configuration profile down to the device without the companion app, and it just won't do anything until the companion app's on there. But it's always good to know that the app has been installed for people to be able to use it. Second, you just need a configuration profile, which is going to have the single sign-on extension payload in it. If you are using the current single sign-on, that enterprise single sign-on extension, you can simply clone that profile and then make the changes necessary to that profile in order to deploy platform single sign-on. And with Okta, you'll actually want to do that anyway because you need to have two configurations for Okta. You actually need to have the Okta FastPass configuration, the enterprise single sign-on installation, and you're going to need the platform single sign-on, aka Okta device access configuration. They are two separate configs. I can get into some of the more technical details during Q&A, but you're going to need those. It's real simple. All I have to do is just copy all these instructions I have here on the screen and just go right to the config, slap them into your config profile. This is in Teensy Tiny Stranovision, and that's terrible, but don't worry. If you go to this link here with either the QR code or the short link, that's going to jump you to a landing page on Jamf Nation that actually has what you need in each of the payloads. And remember, folks, this is definitely making a cake, not you're baking a cake, not making a steak. Nobody wants a medium rare cake. You must follow the recipe exactly. Otherwise, unexpected results will occur. So you just copy that in, and for Entra, it's the same config profile for everybody. For Okta, it's actually going to be specific to your tenant because they're not a shared tenancy system. And again, with Microsoft, there's one PSSO profile. Make sure that you have it so it's just the one profile. You can't have the enterprise SSO and the PSSO config on the same device. That will cause problems. But for Okta, there's going to be two separate config profiles. You can still put them in the same payload, but there's going to be two separate profiles. And then once you've done that, you can deploy some extra optional app settings if you wish. I personally like having a notifications payload for each of those apps, so that way the notifications become more sticky. I like having a managed login item so you don't get that annoying message saying such and such has just been updated, and people will turn off the ability to have the launch agent launch the app automatically, things like that. And in some cases, you might have some specific application and custom settings payloads. Microsoft Authenticator, for example, or Microsoft Company Portal, for example, has some additional SSO specific instructions where you can say, I want to allow or deny specific applications from using the single sign-on extension, which I'll let you read that link again. They have all of the details. And then once you got those two things installed, that's it. You just wait and you wait, because there is nothing that will activate this automatically. Your end user has to actually physically press the button there in the notification center and actually do the registration. Until that point, nothing will happen, but you can report on those good users. There's an extension attribute again on that same link there, so you can find out which computers have activated the single sign-on, the platform single sign-on, and give them pats on the head for being such good security folks. Now, remember, because this is three separate pieces, if you do have any problems, you are probably going to be entering in multiple support cases. If you have questions on how this interacts with File Vault or any third-party application and how it interacts with the single sign-on extension in any way, you should enter an AppleCare support case. The identity provider will have anything to do with why is it not automatically signing me into things. Why is this web page not loading properly in a Google Chrome? They use their own network stack, so they haven't gotten it working yet. Jamf support is going to be limited to things that Jamf can control, like deploying a configuration profile or deploying an application. It's not something that we can really debug. Why can't I log into Microsoft Word with the single sign-on extension? That's outside of our control. If you do have the need, you might enter a support case in all three of these organizations, and I would recommend doing that, especially so Apple will know what the limitations are of its framework. But remember that you're not going to get an answer from Jamf about a Microsoft issue, just as a heads up. That being said, you can contact us if you'd like to get all these login events and get that information in using the new Telemetry 2 version of Jamf Protect that just came out for the unified logging. Anyway, that's the end of the advertisements, I swear. So that's it. We've talked about platform single sign-on and the authentication methods, the different identity providers, quick overview of how to deploy it. Instructions are all up on Jamf Nation, again, on that landing page there. I'd encourage you to check it out. I've been actively watching the Mac admin Slack in the platform single sign-on channel and the the Jamf Connect channel, of course, and I'm just at Rabbitt if you need me. My SLA is non-existent if you need help with that, so I would highly recommend that you reach out to the support channels for folks. And of course, if you want any more info about any of this, info@jamf.com. We're glad to help.
Thank you for joining us today. We have new episodes on the first Friday of every month. If you'd like to join our session live, visit the link in the description to get on our mailing list. And if you're looking to get the most out of your Jamf server, visit rocketman.tech to set up a meeting with one of our Jamf experts. That's rocketman.tech.